Although Lewis has had worse weekends from an emotional standpoint in the context of title fights like in China 2007 or Abu Dhabi in 2021, from a performance, confidence and results point of view, the 2024 United States Grand Prix was probably the worst weekend in his F1 career. And now, Mercedes were very inconsistent this weekend. Although they did bring upgrades and the drivers initially were quite happy with them, even though there was more downforce, it made the car extremely peaky, and that led to some pretty bizarre incidents for both of the drivers. Once Russell actually crashed out of qualifying and reverted to the old spec for the race, he was actually much happier and a lot more competitive, which I think just underlines how confused and lost Mercedes still are when it comes to developing their current car. And now, to be honest, this is nothing new for Mercedes because it feels like we've been saying this and the team and the drivers have also been saying this for basically the past 3 years during the ground effect era. It's very difficult to rate where that Mercedes is from a competitive standpoint because even across just one weekend, it can have massive fluctuations in terms of its pace. The weekend actually started with some pretty promising pace with Lewis on the Friday, potentially on a pole lap before he ran into yellow flags, but George managed to still secure P2 on the grid. However, that is as good as it got for Mercedes. That was the peak of their weekend because from then on, George Russell went backwards in the sprint, and then both drivers had some pretty bizarre incidents with Lewis having a spin in FP1, and then Russell also radioed to say that he almost had a spin in the exact same corner due to bouncing. Now, both drivers then also crashed out at turn 19, with Lewis crashing out in the race and George Russell crashing out in qualifying. And now, that is not a coincidence. The fact that both of the drivers experienced bouncing on the same corners and then also crashed out on the same corner as well, it clearly shows that the Mercedes was very unstable, and it clearly shows that the drivers just don't have the confidence in that car. Whilst George, starting from the pit lane and now having to revert to the older upgrades after damaging the new upgrades in his crash in qualifying, made a brilliant comeback back to 6th, overtaking Sergio Perez late on in the race. For Lewis, it was just a weekend to forget. In qualifying, he qualified in P19 behind a Sauber of all things, which was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, that Mercedes, to be honest, is probably faster going backwards than the Sauber is going forwards. And then in the race, despite making a fantastic start, going from P17 to P12 on the opening lap and looking set to have a pretty decent recovery, he then ended up also getting caught out in the bouncing at turn 19 and crashing out for what, to be honest, seems like a very rare occurrence for Lewis Hamilton. I think this weekend has definitely been the low point of Lewis Hamilton's season, and in a way, I think it's also been a bit of a microcosm of the past 3 years in general. That is why I think this weekend is probably the worst of his F1 career, because you can't forget that this season is a bit of a strange one for Lewis. Knowing that he's going to leave Mercedes at the start of the year, then being disappointed along with George Russell and the rest of the team at how uncompetitive this car is, and also how the performance has fluctuated throughout the season. That has got to play games on your mind, and when you're Lewis Hamilton and you have all of these achievements and you are a driver as great as he is, that is going to come with serious criticism, and rightly so. We expect a driver like Lewis to perform at his absolute best regardless of what the equipment is, but he is not being put, along with his teammate, in a position to succeed this season, and along with everything that's been going on mentally with him leaving Mercedes and going to Ferrari, you can clearly see that he is a driver that is very, very low on confidence and looking to re-energize his career next year. The biggest manifestation of this has been in his qualifying, which has been a big topic this season. When you have a driver who's low on confidence and isn't trusting in his car to be able to push it to the absolute limit, especially in qualifying, it's no surprise that Lewis has prioritized the race setup, and that is why, in terms of this season, the best Lewis Hamilton performances have been in the race. What's quite interesting is that if you look at the average qualifying position for both Lewis and George, George is ahead on 5.63 with Lewis on 7.79, but in terms of the entire grid, they are actually right next to each other, with George in 6th and Lewis in 7th. It's also the same story in the championship, with this time Lewis ahead of George on 177 points, with George just 10 points back on 167, but once again they are right next to each other in 6th and 7th. And now, I think what that tells me is that despite the fact that maybe the drivers aren't absolutely maximizing everything that they can get out of that car, I think there's a reason for that. Across the season, the Mercedes and the Mercedes drivers are exactly where you'd expect them to be. The car is just not consistent enough for them to really be able to challenge the likes of the McLaren drivers, the Red Bull drivers, or the Ferrari drivers. I mean, yes, both of them are ahead on average in front of Sergio Perez, but that is a whole other conversation. We know the struggles that Checo is going through, but speaking on average across the season, Mercedes are exactly where they deserve to be. They have given their drivers a car that is inconsistent, and so they are consistently at the back behind all of the top teams. And now, I've already talked about the fluctuations in performance from Mercedes, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that, relatively speaking, they have probably been the most confusing and up and down team on the grid. Let's not forget that they started the 2024 season behind Aston Martin. Now, unfortunately, Aston Martin then got lost themselves and started to get rooted into the midfield, and Mercedes seemed to be on an upward trajectory. There was a big narrative that Mercedes had finally sorted all of their problems, that they were finally heading in the right direction, and for a period of about 4 or 5 races, they were back to challenging for race wins. However, ever since Spa, it's been nothing but downhill, which again just comes back to the main point about this team over the past 3 years, which is that they still do not fully understand their car, and they still don't fully understand, in the same way that Ferrari and Red Bull, who have also gone through ups and downs this season, how to correctly develop their car and how to get themselves out of a development hole. That stretch in the middle of the season between the Canadian Grand Prix and the Belgian Grand Prix is what really makes rating Lewis Hamilton so difficult. It's easy to say that he is being outperformed by George Russell and that he's going through a really bad season both mentally and also with the car, and that maybe he's just losing it. You know, he is a driver in his late 30s, and although people forget this, drivers do tend to start falling off. But then, when the car was capable and when the car allowed him to compete for race wins, I think he was able to elevate himself over George Russell when it mattered most. I think his wins in Silverstone and Spa, despite the fact that George produced a brilliant drive in Spa and did get disqualified, those were top tier Lewis Hamilton performances in races where, to be honest, I don't think people expected him to win. He was able to elevate with the car, which is not an easy thing to do. For example, we've seen Lando Norris really struggle to consistently win races in a really good car this season because he's only just getting used to the pressure of fighting for race wins consistently every single weekend. But Lewis, at his absolute best when the car was working, was able to get back to those astronomical levels, to the point where if you had that Lewis Hamilton in a good car across the entire season, he would be easily able to challenge and beat the likes of Max and Charles Leclerc for championships. That's what makes it so difficult to judge Lewis's season. At his absolute best across a very strong period where the car was capable of race wins, he looked every bit the driver who could still fight for a world championship, but his season has been marred in this inconsistency, which blurs just how good of a driver he potentially still is. All of this sets us up for what I think should be an absolutely incredible 2025 season, especially at Ferrari. The dynamics of the two drivers going into the year could not be more different. Charles Leclerc is having the best season in his career. He has become an incredibly well-rounded driver, still having that electric and exciting raw pace, especially in qualifying, but now also adding all of the other major things he needs to challenge for a world championship. His race IQ is the best it's ever been. Obviously, his tyre wear, he's proven time and time again, is also exceptional, being able to make one-stop strategies work to win races. And also, he has stopped making those mistakes and big crashes that people were very critical of in 2021 and 2022. Given the criticism that's been laid on Lando about how he drives in wheel-to-wheel combat, especially up against Max, when it comes to Leclerc, I think mentally, Charles is bulletproof. He is not scared to go up against Max Verstappen, he's not going to be scared to go up against Lewis Hamilton, and as I said, he is almost the complete package now. Being just 22 points behind Lando in the championship in the fight for P2 I think is absolutely ridiculous, given that the Ferrari hasn't exactly been consistently as good as it is now across the entire season. Also, having bagged 3 wins I think is massive, especially in Monza and Monaco, which are by far the 2 biggest races of the year, both in terms of expectations and pressure on Charles' shoulders. And the only thing now going into next year is that he is going to have an expectation from Ferrari to continue this very strong form and give him a title-challenging car. All of this sets us up for an absolutely titanic battle at Ferrari for next year. Underpinning everything is going to be a massive expectation and a hell of a lot of pressure from the media and the tifosi at Ferrari that they have to give their drivers a title-challenging car from the beginning of 2025. Then when it comes to the drivers, like I said, the dynamics could not be more opposite. On one side, you've got Charles Leclerc, who's got the stability and is going to have incredible form going into next season, wanting to challenge for his first ever World Championship. And in terms of Lewis, he is going to step into Maranello, massively motivated by his brand new move to Ferrari, massively reinvigorated with a new challenge, a new environment, and a new set of people, and also focused with a bit of a chip on his shoulder. Even though every single driver is always focused on their team in the here and now, I do wonder how much Lewis is looking at how Ferrari has improved in the latter half of 2024, and I kind of wonder what kind of motivation is he feeling to just get to 2025 as quick as possible. The great thing about Ferrari under Frederic Vasseur is that they are improving and they are understanding their car even when things have gone wrong. 2023 actually bucked the trend as Ferrari scored more points in the second half of the season than they did in the first. Historically, Ferrari have actually struggled to develop over the course of the season, but we have now seen this twice in back-to-back years in 23 and 24 under Frederic Vasseur. Having said that, making that next jump from winning races to actually becoming title challengers is going to bring with it a huge amount of pressure. And when you look at the way Ferrari is setting up, bringing in Lewis Hamilton, having Charles Leclerc, who is just so hungry to challenge for a world championship, and then all of the rhetoric about how Ferrari are improving, I think that there's going to be a huge amount of pressure on this team and a huge amount of pressure on Lewis Hamilton, and rightly so. As a 7-time world champion, he is always going to be criticized more than anyone else for underperforming, but he has shown this season that he still has what it takes to win a world championship, and the only question is now, can he work with Ferrari to get himself in the best place mentally and to be at one with the car next season? And can he also overcome Leclerc, which is going to be a monumental challenge for next year, to come back to where he wants to be, which is challenging for an 8th world championship? Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.